Now we're going to talk about complex sentences. Remember, a compound means two or double, to compound something, means to make more of it. Then a complex sentence is made up of different types of clauses. A compound is made up of two independent clauses. A complex sentence is complicated, it's complex. So it's made up of two different types of clauses. It's made up of an independent clause and a dependent clause. And so we have, generally speaking, there's two broad ways to make a complex sentence. There are actually lots and lots of ways that we can include dependent clauses inside of a clause, and you use those quite often if you use a who, which clause, or that, or something. It might go in the middle of an independent clause. So you have an independent clause on the outside and a dependent clause sandwiched inside of that independent clause. But generally, the way we write right now, there are two different types of complex sentences. We can have an independent clause followed by a dependent clause. And if that's our case, we don't need any punctuation. There's no comma between the two clauses because the independent clause came first. Our second type is a dependent clause followed by an independent clause. And that dependent clause usually starts with a subordinating conjunction. After, although, as, you can sing your jingle, but whenever, any of those can begin a dependent clause, and it's followed by an independent clause. And when we set it up this way, we do need to have that comma after the dependent clause. When I went to the store, comma, I bought bread, cookies, and lunch meat. So we always follow that with a comma when the dependent clause comes first in the sentence. Here's two examples of it, and see if you can identify which is our dependent clause and which is our independent clause. So sentence number 1. Because Max often tormented the Norwegian factory workers, they captured him and brought him to England. So remember, a clause has to have a subject and a verb. So let's go find our subject and verbs here. We find verbs first because they're usually the easiest to recognize. So we're looking for an action or a linking verb. Because Max often tormented the Norwegian factory workers. Well, tormented is an action, right? He's doing something that torments them. And so tormented is our verb. Who's doing the tormenting? Max. So Max is our subject. So there's our first clause, because Max often tormented the Norwegian factory workers. Is that a dependent clause or an independent clause? If it's a dependent clause, it's an incomplete thought. If it's an independent clause, we could leave it alone as a sentence all by itself. Because Max often tormented the Norwegian factory workers. That's not a complete thought, right? There's a result that comes from this. A because means there's a result that comes from it. So that's an incomplete thought. So that means it's a dependent clause that starts our sentence. So remember, with dependent clauses, we put parentheses around it. Workers, parentheses. They captured him and brought him to England. So looking at this sentence, it has in it two verbs, right? Two actions that are happening. They captured is a verb. It's an action. They're doing something. And brought is a verb. Again, another action. They're doing something. So those are both verbs. Who captured and brought? They did. Subject, noun. So there's our second one. They captured him and brought him to England. Is that a complete thought? Could that stand on its own as a sentence all by itself? They captured him and brought him to England. Yeah, it could. It's an independent clause because it's a complete thought. So we're going to put that in brackets. All right, because Max often tormented the Norwegian factory workers, they captured him and brought him to England. So here we have a dependent clause followed by an independent clause. So look back up here. If the dependent clause comes first, do we need a comma or no comma? And if you look, dependent clause comes first, therefore it has a comma in it. So after our first dependent clause, we will put a comma under or next to workers. And there you have a properly punctuated complex sentence made up of a dependent clause followed by an independent clause with a comma in between it. Our second sentence up here, you need to be looking to see, is it a dependent clause first or an independent clause first? So, number 2, Max made life very difficult for Ginger and the other midshipmen when he was on board the ship. Okay, so let's go and find our verbs so that we can then find our subjects. Max made life very difficult. Max did. What's the action happening here? He made life difficult. So that's our verb. Who made? Max did. That's our subject. Max made life very difficult for Ginger and the other midshipmen. So there's our first clause. That's our first complete set of words and complete thought. So is it dependent? Meaning it could stand, it needs, it's an incomplete thought. It needs something else to finish the thought. Or is it independent? Meaning it could stand on itself, on its own as a complete sentence. Max made life very difficult for Ginger and the other midshipmen. Well, that's independent, right? We could leave that as a complete sentence. So we're going to put a bracket there and a bracket there. Our next set of words, when he was on board the ship. What is our subject here? This time we don't, well, we do have an action verb, but it is a little bit, he's not doing something, we don't have an action verb, we have a being verb. It's a state of being. He was is our verb. That is a state of being. Who was? He, subject. When he was on board the ship, is that a complete thought? Can that stand alone as its own sentence? No, it's not complete. We don't know what happened when he was standing alone or when he was on board the ship. So it can't stand alone. So that's dependent. So we're going to put parentheses around it and parentheses around it here. So first we have a dependent clause. First we have an independent clause followed by a dependent clause. And when the independent clause comes first and it's followed by the dependent clause, we don't need that comma in it. And while this is not always a great way to determine which clause, whether or not you need a comma in something, you do often hear the commas, so to speak, when you read the sentence. If we read the first one, because Max often tormented the Norwegian factory workers, they captured him and brought him to England. You can kind of hear that pause in the sentence. We need that comma, that thought to give us, okay, because of this, now therefore this. You can kind of hear it. Whereas the other way, Max made life very difficult for Ginger and the other midshipmen when he was on board the ship. We don't need a pause in that sentence. It flows more naturally together that direction. We could flip it around. We could say, when he was on board the ship, comma, Max made life very difficult for Ginger and the other midshipmen. Then we would need a comma. Or the first one we could flip around. We could say the Norwegian factory workers captured Max and brought him to England because Max often tormented the Norwegian factory workers. So we can always flip those around, and they often will make sense. Sometimes flipped around they don't make sense, but oftentimes you can flip them around and they do. But what you need to remember for complex sentences for our review for today is if the independent clause comes first and is followed by a dependent clause, no comma. If the dependent clause comes first and is followed by an independent clause, then we do need a comma. Okay? And that's all that you need to know for today.